and good evening. And we're going to keep moving forward with our discussion groups tonight, and we're going to be moving forward to the concept and the topic of sacrifice. When you think about sacrifice and you think about it in the entire context of the Bible, something that's really interesting when you consider this as a spiritual discipline that we must practice. Sacrifice is so key to the entire story of the Bible. If you read from the very beginning all the way through to its end and to its continually ending that is happening as we continue in the Christian walk. From the very beginning, we have the introduction of the entire world, the creation of the entire world, and then we have the introduction of the sin problem that happens when Adam and Eve fall away. And it's the sin problem that is trying to be combated against throughout the entirety of the Bible. And we see that the main combatant to sin, the solution to sin, we find often in this practice of sacrifice. First, we see it in the Mosaic Law, and then we see it later on in Jesus' sacrifice, and then we see it in how we pattern our own lives today. So turn over to Leviticus chapter 4. Let's get some context on what it means to sacrifice, or what sacrifices were. What was their purpose? Why did they exist in the first place? Leviticus chapter 4, and then we're going to be spending the majority of our time tonight here in Hebrews chapter 9 and 10. Those two passages in those two chapters provide a bridge from this Old Testament, Old Covenant, Old sacrifice to this concept of a new sacrifice. All throughout Leviticus chapter 4, it describes these sin offerings. There were a lot of different sacrifices, a lot of different offerings that you would have had throughout the Mosaic Law, but this gets a nice idea of what sacrifices were, and you start getting an image of their nature and how visceral they truly were. Beginning in verse 1 of chapter 4, it says, "Now the Lord spoke to Moses, saying, Speak to the children of Israel, saying, If a person sins unintentionally against any of the commandments of the Lord in anything which ought not to be done, and does any of them, if the anointed priest sins, bringing guilt on the people, then let him offer to the Lord for his sin, which he has sinned, a young bull without blemish as a sin offering." So there we go. We see the purpose there. So it says, when you have sinned, you're going to offer this sacrifice. And when you think about this sacrifice, as we keep reading, notice the really aggressive, really vicious imagery as we start considering this idea of sacrifice. Beginning in verse 4, "He shall bring the bull to the door of the tabernacle of the meeting before the Lord, lay his hands on the bull's head, and kill the bull before the Lord. The anointed priest shall take some of the bull's blood and bring it to the tabernacle of meeting. The priest shall dip his finger in the blood and sprinkle some of the blood 7 times before the Lord in front of the veil of the sanctuary. And the priest shall put some of the blood on the horns of the altar of sweet incense before the Lord, which is in the tabernacle of meeting. And he shall pour the remaining blood of the bull at the base of the altar of burnt offering, which is at the door of the tabernacle of meeting." So it keeps going on. If you want to read more that talks about the specific parts of the animal, what they're supposed to do with them, but you really get this image of how brutal this actually was. And think about the Israelites who were going about this process of sacrifice. This animal is meant to take on those sins that you've committed, and they're the ones who suffer and die for it. If you think about it from the Israelites' perspective, what's happening to that animal is what's supposed to happen to them. They're the ones who are supposed to be killed, brutally murdered, and then have their blood poured out as an offering. But they don't. And that's the concept of sacrifice, this heavy concept of sacrifice for the purpose of forgiving sins for these people. And if you turn to Hebrews chapter 9, we start getting more and more of this picture, and we start seeing this bridge from this Old Testament purpose of sacrifice. Because the purpose of sacrifice in the Old Testament to the New Testament is very similar, but there's one key difference. If you begin in verse 22 of Hebrews chapter 9, it says, "And according to the law, almost all things are purified with blood, and without shedding of blood, there's what? No remission." Sacrifice is crucial in getting rid of sins. It's an incredibly important thing, not only for the Israelites, but it's incredibly important for us. Look in chapter 10, skip ahead real quick. It says, "For the law having a shadow of the good things to come, and not the very image of the things, can never, with these same sacrifices, which they offer continually year by year, make those who approach perfect. For then would they not have ceased to be offered? For the worshippers, once purified, have no more consciousness of sins. But in those sacrifices there is a reminder of sins every year. For it is not possible the blood of bulls and goats could take away sins. So he talks about these Old Testament sacrifices. This is just a shadow. This is just a small inkling of what the true sacrifice is. And then he dives here in verse 5 and he talks about Jesus' sacrifice. Verse 5, therefore, when he came into the world, he said, sacrifice and offering you did not desire, but a body you prepared for me. And burnt offerings and sacrifices for sin you had no pleasure. Then I said, behold, I have come. In the volume of the book it is written of me to do your will, O God. Previously saying, and it talks about all those things, is behold, I have come to do your will. It's Jesus talking about what he's coming to do. In verse 10, there's the key. But that will we have been sanctified through the offering of the body of Jesus Christ once for all. That's the sacrifice that we've been given. That's the opportunity we have to live as Christians. It's that sacrifice that Jesus made. That's the foundation. His sacrifice, his death, and then the coming resurrection. That's the foundation of all Christianity. Sacrifice is the very core of who we are as Christians. So how do we incorporate this idea of sacrifice into our own lives? Romans chapter 12, verses 1 through 2 gives us that answer. And the answer is not just clear-cut as saying, oh, you just need to sacrifice this specific thing and you're good. That's what it is. But sacrifice is more of a mindset. It's more of a lifestyle that you live all throughout. And that's the spiritual discipline I want us to look tonight. In verse 1 and 2 of chapter 12 of Romans, we see this concept of living sacrifices. It says, I beseech you, therefore, brethren, by the mercies of God, that you present your bodies a living sacrifice, holy, acceptable to God, which is your reasonable service. And do not be conformed to this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind, that you may prove what is that good and acceptable and perfect will of God. This idea of being a living sacrifice. You're constantly on that altar, constantly pouring yourself out, constantly covering up through Jesus your sins. And it's this idea of this perpetual nature of you don't get off that altar. You don't sacrifice just once for yourself, but because of the things that Jesus has done for you, you live your life in service to him, in service to others, because he gave you that life to begin with. Allow yourself to be constantly sacrificial in everything you do with your lives. It's not limited to just one thing. It's not limited at all. Be sacrificial. Be that living sacrifice. Serve as a living sacrifice would. There's some more questions that we're going to discuss in our discussion groups tonight, and I hope you can take this idea of sacrifice as we discuss it, and we can place more of an emphasis on it and understand more how we can understand and put it forward in our lives. Because if we act sacrificially, if we act like those living sacrifices, we continually point to Jesus. If you haven't had the opportunity tonight, to come and be part of that, we encourage you. If you have been a part of that, if you're trying to live like a living sacrifice, but you've struggled and you've fallen away, we love you. We're here to help. If you need anything, please come as we stand and as we sing.